Thank you Tuan Pengacara Majlis dan salam sejahtera tuan-tuan dan puan-puan. Good evening to all participants. We've heard high power sessions from economists, megatrends, geopolitical risks, and in the last session, a very interesting take on transformative tech, where they also discuss about competitive edge and inclusivity. So now it's time for the bankers to give their perspective. What we're going to cover today is firstly about the existing financing channels, followed by structuring considerations that bankers normally look at, whether it be loans or bonds. And then finally, speaking about suitable structuring solutions, which is the topic. This is the first part of two sessions for financing data centers. The next one will be about tackling the risks of financing data centers. So we had a pre-discussion, and one of the requests from my panelists was to conduct a poll on your familiarity with data centers. So can I just ask you to very quickly do this poll? I know it's a bit anticlimactic since we've, it's like the six. No, we're fine. Let's see. They already started taking part. It's just for fun. Yeah. Okay, very good. Might be blocking the screen. Are we good? All right, there's still some votes coming in. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, good. All right, so I think this is just for our information because we're going to be speaking about types of data centers, what are the suitable financing solutions. So just to start things off, I've prepared a slide. There you go. And there are several types of data centers, edge data centers, enterprise data centers, which I assume, which is a bit niche, and I assume many of you may be familiar with already, but I've listed down these three types of data centers. This is my own cheat sheet. Actually, RAM in their just released report has a more comprehensive table on page 2. You can refer to that. But this is my own cheat sheet just to differentiate these three types of data centers because we'll be speaking mainly about these three types. So basically, retail colocation, wholesale colocation, and hyperscale colocation. These are basically what I have summarized that differentiates the three types. First of all, by size, retail colocation is generally up to 5 megawatt. The bigger ones, for example, wholesale colocation is from 5 to 40 megawatts, and hyperscale 40, way above 40, in some cases 300 megawatt. And tenant requirements are different as well. Modest for retail, large for wholesale, and very large for hyperscale. Lease tenants also is very different. Short for retail, long for wholesale, and much, much longer for hyperscale, in which case is more than 10 years. Obviously, by tenant concentration, hyperscales have the lowest tenant concentration, large hyperscalers, as they call them. For wholesale, high as well. And for tenant concentration for retail colocation data centers, actually very high. Small tenants requiring very little customization, as you can see from the last row. And it moves higher for wholesale and very high for hyperscale. So that's my very short cheat sheet on what types of data centers there are. I'd like to start the session by talking about the available financing channels in the Asian space. And The first question I'd like to pose to Vishesh, who heads up digital infrastructure for APAC in SMBC. I'd like to know what are the types of financing structures that is normally done in the Asia space?
Yeah, hi. So, sorry, I think is it too loud or? Okay. No, so I think, look, financing, of course, if we're talking about funding of a project, your typical forms are equity, debt, and everything in between, right? And at least what we have seen and what I have seen personally financing this space for the digital infra space and particularly data centers for the last, call it 10 to 15 years. I mean, 15 years ago, there were very few transactions, maybe 1 in 2 years. These days, there are 2 transactions every month. It's still beyond sort of the typical equity. On the debt side, it is still really heavily bank dominated. So it's a lot of bank financing. Now, again, we can talk through structures and the kind of financings which happen. I think there is also a market for slightly subordinated debt, which is more sort of equity-like in a way, or in between sort of real equity and debt. We haven't seen that much, in terms of, I guess, CDOs and CMOs and the collateralization of these loans, which is what is prevalent in the US, but just not here in Asia. Not particularly, no real reason why it's not here for DCs. I've not seen that for other sectors as well. But really, if I look at the fundings that have happened from a debt standpoint, again, I don't have the stats, but I would imagine 95% would be bank market. And of course, bonds would come into play as markets are more conducive. And maybe Joey as CGIF, you can probably chime in on that. Good to tickle the moderator.
Okay, before I answer your question, if you could just name the dominant types of financing structures in the market, as you just mentioned, would they, my understanding, and perhaps you could validate, is in Asia, we only see project finance, LBO/leverage type of financing, and corporate/REIT type of financing. These are the major types of financing structures in Asia right now?
Yeah, so I think the most common, and given that this asset class is relatively new, the most common is infrastructure/project style financing, right? I mean, being very honest, again, if you look at very traditional project financing, I don't think data center financings tick all the boxes. If you look at very traditional leverage buyouts and LBOs, again, I don't think data center financings tick all the boxes. Typical LBOs cap out at 5-6 times leverage, debt to EBITDA. Data centers can go much higher, right? I mean, without taking names, it can go in double digits as well for the right asset, for the right offtake. So typically, if I were to look at financing in this space, I would keep it in 2 buckets. One is large local corporates who have strong relationships and, of course, support from banks. Those type of financings happen the slightly different lens. They happen with a relationship/corporate lens. Rest is your typical limited/non-recourse financings, whether it is somebody buying an asset, somebody building an asset. And the most critical aspect there, to my mind, is visibility of cash flows, contracted, as well as people getting comfort on uncontracted cash flows, but visibility/confidence in renewals. To me, that's how these deals are looked at. Now you can put a project finance spin to it, you can put a leverage finance spin to it, you can, PF covenants are DSCRs, leverage finance covenants are debt to EBITDA. But again, none of these financings, as far as I see, are very hardcore in one of these 2 buckets. I've not done a very proper LBO because there are heavy capex elements. I've not done a full-blown proper PF, which is very long-term money, 15-year loan. There's a offtake for 25 years. For 20 years, you get repaid within the period. It's all, to me, a hybrid, right? And again, we can go deeper into it, but it's really a hybrid.
So it sounds like it's very customized based on the appetite of the bank and the relationship with the borrower. So
super customized. I mean, across the 10-15 deals that we would have done in the last 12 months, I would say maybe 2 would have similar, like 90% same structure. It's all very bespoke. And the market is evolving, right? Telecom towers, which is again digital infra, that was a market which was a very standard market. I mean, you would ballpark know how deal would be done. Here, we are looking at 3-4 deals in Malaysia right now. We have never done those structures.
Sure. Okay, so I think you brought up some pertinent points, which I think we'll go back to later about structuring, and you mentioned some covenants there. But so we'll come back to that later. Thanks for that. And I think a bit closer to home, and this is a question for Shireen. Could you share with us what role can development financial institutions play in financing DCs or promoting the DC growth in Malaysia?
Okay, so again, this is not a new industry. It has been around. It's just that we've seen rapid growth over the past few years, at least 3 years or so. So we do see a lot of data centers mushrooming, especially in the Greater Klang Valley and Johor. And today, we have the top 3 hyperscalers setting up data centers in Malaysia. So you have Amazon, Google, Microsoft, and total investment over the next few years is at least about $10 billion US. And we also see a lot of local companies coming into this sector. And interestingly, state-owned companies are also coming in, partnering together with foreign companies or existing ICT players. So where we play our role is Bank Pembangunan, we are owned by Ministry of Finance. So we basically support projects or initiatives that government is pushing for. So data center falls under ICT, and this is one of the key initiatives under the INMP 2030. And there are a few other frameworks that covers data center. So when we look at data center, we actually look at the ecosystem. So we're not just looking at the building, the data center developer itself, but we look at the technology park operator, okay, where they require funding to build the infrastructure, which is your connectivity to electricity, water. You need lots of water for data center for the cooling system, and also the internet connectivity. So normally they require huge capital investment upfront, and the tenure of the financing can be long. And then we look at the developer of the data center. So this is normally funding capital expenditure to build the data center itself. So it depends whether it's enterprise or co-location. We don't have so much requests on the hyperscale because these are predominantly dominated by the foreign companies. So again, we are owned by MOF, so we looked at local companies. And then we have the EPCC, the main con, subcon, where we have contract financing to support this sector. Then we have the tenants, as well as the supply of the equipment, where there's another DFI, which is Exim Bank, that can look at importing this equipment. So to show how serious we are in not just data center, but in digitalization, government has actually allocated 1 billion funds where there's a subsidy of 1.5% from the profit that we charge. There's a slide. I have a slide on this. Okay, so this is just one of the schemes that we have, which is called Industry Digitalization Transformation Scheme. The amount, yes, 1 billion, it can be very subjective. It can be high for some and low for others. But we have a total scheme of 6.7 billion where we give subsidy of 1.5%. So we do cover sustainability, Madani, and any other projects that basically contribute to the national development.
Thank you, Shireen. Thank you for sharing that. And in talking about financing or funding solutions for data centers, I suppose we cannot escape from the topic of decarbonization or sustainability. And the voluntary carbon market has kicked off in Malaysia with the introduction of the Bursa Carbon Exchange. I would like to ask Rizal, who is from BCX, can you tell us more about this carbon exchange, and how can it be an additional source of funding for data centers?
Okay, thanks very much, Joey, for that question. Usually I will take about 15 minutes just to explain how the carbon market works, but in the interest of time, I think we can flash up the slide that I shared, the next one. Yeah. So basically, the carbon markets are designed to channel funding from the private sector towards carbon project developers. And these projects which are linked to activities that either avoid, reduce, or remove GHG emissions from the atmosphere. So although not all carbon reducing projects are considered or valid as carbon projects, if you look at the method of how carbon credits are generated and utilized, first off, if you look at the supply side, a carbon project developer needs to first select a particular standard methodology, and then they'll have to go through a validation and verification process. And finally, the standard will then issue carbon credits to the project developer. And then this can be traded, for example, on our Bursa Carbon Exchange. And then for companies or corporates to actually retire them towards their targets of net zero and so on. So if you're talking about data centers, I've highlighted some of the available methodologies that may be applicable to the data centers. So there's a few standards out there. The biggest one is called Verra, and gold standard is a close second. So under gold standard, there are a few methodologies, and these are actually some of the methodologies that they adopt from the CDM era, which is during the Kyoto Protocol era. And I've just highlighted a few examples here. So this includes, for example, waste energy recovery at ACM 0012, that's just a code. And then there's AM 0060, power saving through replacement by more energy efficient chillers. And there's also a methodology of energy efficiency in data centers through dynamic power management. So what it means is that if you develop this kind of carbon projects, you can actually sell the credits to the buyers, and then you earn revenue from the carbon credits. And this allows you to develop these kind of projects when they are not actually, financially additional. So that's the one criteria for carbon projects, is that it has to comply with financial additionality. And what this means is that you need to prove that the project needs revenue from carbon credits in order for it to become commercially viable. So this actually provides, any industry actually, but also for data centers to actually get additional revenue from selling of carbon credits, and for corporates to offset and purchase it to offset their own emissions. Yeah, I hope that makes sense. Thanks.
And since data centers are known to be basically substantial consumers of energy, so would you say that the amounts to be raised from selling or buying transactions arising out of this would be significant for data centers?
It would be significant to the project that it embarks on. I think, for example, YTL earlier was talking about liquid cooling. So I'm not really familiar with data centers technicalities, but if that particular technology is something new and there's quite a high capex required, and it's literally can't be funded, it's literally can't be commercially viable if you just rely on the other types of funds alone, and you require carbon credits to actually fund it, then it can be an eligible carbon project. So even if it's not available under a certain methodology, let's say under Verra or Gold Standard, project developers can actually go to the standards and to the registries and propose these kind of projects, saying that, look, we are proposing this project because it actually will reduce energy consumption or even water consumption and so on. And if it's accepted, then you can actually start going through the methodology and then eventually trading the carbon credits and earn additional revenue from that. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Rizal. Next up, I'd like to discuss about structuring considerations. Shereen, you were talking about co-location types of data centers and enterprise. Well, could you share your thought process when you structure, when you approach financing for these type of data centers? Is there a difference between the two? Or is what is common when you look at the let's say the credit of such exposures?
So for the enterprise data center, like what Vishesh mentioned earlier, right? We looked at the strength of the company because that one is basically, it's just like any other company setting up factories or warehouses where it's basically classified under corporate lending, right? But when we look at co-location, so internally in Bank Pembangunan, we've decided to park it under real estate. Okay. Reason why it's real estate is because similar to say for example a shopping mall where the owner built the shopping mall and leased out the lettable area. Okay, you're subject to market risk, completion risk, operator risk, maintenance risk. So co-location is similar in the sense that the owner of the data center built the data center and leased out the white space. When during the construction, you will not get any tenants coming in. So the best you can get is letter of interest or memorandum of understanding. So there is market risk there where upon completion, then that's when you get lease agreement signed with the tenants. So because of all these factors, so how we look at it, the risk that we have to take, there's not much difference from real estate. So when we structure it, yes, we do provide grace period during the construction period. And then the repayment, it will be basically matching with the cash flow coming in because to get tenants coming in 100% in year one, it can be quite challenging. So that requires ramp-up period of probably 2 or 3 years. So we will do the repayment to match the cash flow coming in. In Bank Pembangunan, we don't prefer to take refinancing risk. And therefore, we can go long, we can go more than 10 years if need be, to make sure that the debt is paid by the cash flow coming in from the project instead of being subjected to credit risk.
Yeah, so on your last point, refinancing risk, I think that's a pertinent point for property financing in general. So if because you said to mitigate refinancing risk, basically your point was you rarely structure a bullet redemption and would rather have the exposure amortized from cash flows over the tenor of the loan.
Yes.
Can I just ask a side question then? How do you decide on the appropriate tenor of the loan? For example, retail co-location, as we have found out, have relatively shorter tenor of lease. So do you structure the tenor according to the longest door-to-door lease, or do you take some position on the renewability of that tenancy and provide a longer tenor so that it gives them time to amortize the loan?
Okay, so yes, when it comes to the lease agreement, you typically see 3 plus 3 plus 3 plus 3 or 5 plus 5 plus 5 plus 5. But the switching costs in this industry is actually high. So the moment the tenant comes in, they tend to stay for long. You hardly see them moving to another data center unless there is a really strong reason for them to leave that particular data center. Otherwise, they will stay. So because of that, we're willing to take the risk to stretch it until the cash flow can repay the debt obligation.
Okay, sure. Vishesh, any thoughts or any color on hyperscale data centers, considering the tenor of the tenor of the underlying lease contracts, the profile of the tenants, obviously hyperscalers and wholesale, different type of counterparty risks involved? What are your structuring considerations? Are they similar to co-location, retail or wholesale co-location types? Or is there any difference from the international lender's perspective?
Yeah. Look, I think maybe I'll start with a little bit of silent marketing as well. The reason we are slightly unique that we have a dedicated digital infrastructure financing team, which is about 10 people now. And the reason we did that is because as we went through the journey, we realized that transactions, deals, assets, I mean, one can look at them as real estate, one can look at them as infrastructure, then you have corporate deals, you have LBOs. And to just share an anecdote, one of the deals we did 3 years ago, roughly 3 years ago, which we refinanced recently and upsized, was a transaction where there were 3 banks, right? We were looking at that as somewhat PF style. There was another bank, the same deal, the same facility, right? There was another bank who was looking at that as real estate. And there was a third bank who was looking at that as a TMT deal. And what ultimately happened is it was none of them. So what ultimately happened is there were covenants and structures which were catering for all these strategies, which post the transaction meant that there were a lot of waivers. Things had to be changed. What we have recently done is we have refinanced that deal, lesser banks and like-minded banks. The reason I start with that is if you see this asset class, right, I would not bucket it by contracts. It's really by what you're looking at. So if you look at co-location data centers, they're not built to suit, right? Co-location data centers are really where you can have other customers come in. So it's more like a retail market, right? If you've got the right team, the right sort of strategy behind it, if they have proven that they can bring customers, manage the business, I mean, yes, people will come and go. That's part and parcel of co-location, right? Then comes wholesale. Then again, who are your wholesale enterprise customers? There are some customers who are very sticky. I mean, telcos can be quite sticky. Banks can be quite sticky, right? These people, or for them, there might be benefits of moving, but these are ancillary services for them, right? And there are also operational hassle involved. There is operational hassle involved in moving. Then comes hyperscalers, which is built to suit. So again, as we look at these 3, as I said at the start, for us, the most critical factor is what visibility do we have in terms of revenues, contracted as well as uncontracted, where we believe the clients, either them or a replacement customer will be there. So the way we structure these deals is we look at this from a notional basis, and I'll need a minute to explain that. So honestly, if you ask me, as long as we have the funding currency, we can go any tenor that we have, right? We can do a 3-year bullet. We can amortize a little bit in year 4 and make it a 5-year loan, and we can keep going. The way we look at this is, what is my visibility? Year 1 of cash flow generation to year N, let's say, for argument's sake, 10, right? Hyperscalers can be longer, and we generally go longer. But between the year 1 and year 10, we are indifferent. I mean, we can finance this as a 3-year loan with a full bullet. We can finance this as a 5-year loan with 70% bullet. We can finance as a 7-year loan with slightly shorter bullet, right? I mean, we generally do take refinancing risk because we find that you have to make the requirements work of this. I mean, this is a very great sector, but it's a tough sector as well, right? It's not easy. What is being done, returns are not super high as well, and everybody needs to play their part. So we structure it flexibly enough. And really, when it comes to hyperscalers, the very typical market is that you'd see deals which are, in my mind, 5 years-ish in tenor, 7 years, with a year and a half, 2 years of construction moratorium. Again, based on experience and doing that across towers as well, I have not seen most of the digital infra financings last their original tenor of 5 years. Once the construction risk is over, you start to see revenues. These are very stable assets. These can be refinanced. So we don't recommend people to go 15 years because 15 years, of course, means much higher cost of capital, much higher fees. We recommend a sweet spot of around 5-ish years, give or take here and there, and then you refinance the deal before that. And we've done that already in a few situations in DCs. We have done that across almost all tower deals that we have done in Asia.
And sorry, just a side point. So you asked me a question about CGIF's appetite or for data centers, right? So we do look at we have studied the financing structures for data centers. We even have pipelines for data centers right now, and basically we found it to be very REIT-like in structure. That means we structure data center financing like how we would look at a REIT, basically, as Shireen mentioned. There's a renewal risk. We need to be comfortable with that. There is the counterparty risk would matter. The quality and the tenor of the contracts also matter. Yeah, but bouncing back a question to you, what we've also noticed, a lot of banks, international banks, who've done leverage buyouts, financing of leverage buyouts, typically they like to structure their repayment as a two-prong. There will be a small repayment in the penultimate year, followed by a bullet in the final year. Just a question: why is that? What are the thoughts in that sort of repayment structure?
Look, I think LBOs typically, right? Once a company is acquired, the first few years, and again, as I said, these are not typical LBOs. I've hardly seen a deal where traditionally LBOs are you buy an asset, you maximize leverage, and you give the seller much higher multiple and returns when they go out, right? Because you can juice up leverage and you can make your own returns work. But in data centers, the LBOs we have seen and done, they generally have a very heavy capex element. So there is investment that needs to happen post buying the business. It is not just buying and running it, right? So typically, I mean, you have capex lines. You can have amortization in the first 3 years, but they will draw your capex line anyways. So net, these businesses are net consumers of loans. They will not be able to repay you in the first 2-3 years. There's a small amount sometimes in year 4. And again, maybe a business can repay, but the way I see this, these businesses, they gain scale and they are refinanced in 2-3 years, right? I don't see a lot of these deals lasting 5 years, to be very honest.
Sure. So basically the repayment profile will be sculpted, right? Sculpted to a certain DSCR or a buffer to a DSCR that needs to be become a covenant.
LBO's more debt to EBITDA, but the repayment profile is sculpted for year 0 to year 10, the last example, and whether the business can repay the loan in that period of time.
Okay. One Q&A. Okay. One more question before Q&A, just a very quick one, because touching on sustainability again. A question for Rizal. Does being sustainable, having decarbonization goals, raising thematic financing, adopting KPIs, how does this benefit data centers or trading RECs? I'll give an example. IFC supported Yondr Group's 300 megawatt green data center, and coming from the multilateral background, to provide support to a private sector entity, there needs to be some kind of development justification, such as thematic financing, which CGIF has supported over many deals. So could you maybe provide some thoughts about that before we enter the Q&A?
Sure. Thanks, Joey. Yeah, so I guess it depends on company to company. Generally, most MNCs would already have certain ESG target or certain sustainability targets already embedded, and it's likely a requirement by the shareholders or some of the key stakeholders, or perhaps even their financiers, to actually achieve a certain form of decarbonization. And for data centers in particular, it's a high electricity usage type of facility. And if I can just share my last slide so just to share some of the options that data centers, I mean, this is applicable for all companies or all facilities, but particularly for data centers since it utilizes a lot of electricity. So this example is a facility that uses about 100,000 megawatt hour of electricity, and under emissions reporting, this is considered scope 2 emissions. And the prudent method is to actually reduce your electricity consumption as best as you can. So the lowest hanging fruit is to actually install on-site renewables such as rooftop solar or ground-mounted solar and things like that. And the next option is to, if you don't have enough roof area or ground area, you can also look for off-site renewables, such as the newly launched CRESS program, Corporate Renewable Energy Supply Scheme. They can also go for what's called bundled RECs or bundled renewable energy certificates. Again, I don't have 15 minutes to explain what renewable energy certificates are, but it's basically the green attributes of renewable energy production. So you can actually purchase just the attribute portion without buying the electricity. But in the case of bundled RECs, you are buying it together with the electricity. So for a good example is the Green Electricity Tariff Program. When you purchase electricity and you just pay a premium, and you actually get the rights to the renewable energy to reduce your scope 2 emissions. And the last option is to, well, not actually last, but the other option is to actually use unbundled RECs, meaning to say that you purchase only the green attributes of the renewable energy generation without actually being even connected to the facility itself. So that's what we are offering actually under BCX. And because I'm from BD and sales, I also have to share that we'll have an auction at the end of this year. So if anyone's interested, you can actually scan the QR code. We'll be auctioning Malaysian generated solar, bioenergy, and small hydro RECs on 28 November 2024. So in a nutshell, this actually can become sort of your carbon reduction policy. Of course, you can't just reduce your emissions business as usual and just buy RECs, but you need to go through a certain hierarchy and be prudent in the way that you reduce as much as you can first before you start reducing it by using RECs. And this is also similar for carbon credits, where it's applicable for scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. So yeah, that summarizes the direction of what DCs can actually do.
Okay, thanks, Rizal. Let's start the Q&A. I see some questions about refinancing risks and bonds obsolescence risk. So maybe we can take, let's just take the question on refinancing risk. Yep, since we mentioned this about, basically we're talking about the mismatch of tenor, right, and the underlying cash flows. We talk about how some banks would like to amortize the debt, and some banks are comfortable with refinancing risks on account of, let's say, good cash flows. We mentioned about customers being sticky because the customization cost of hyperscale and wholesale colocation tenants is quite high. And in markets like Hong Kong, which I've come across, there are just not that many, there's not much land for data centers. Many of the data centers are repurposed industrial lots. And there's just nowhere else to shift, given that they've already spent so much to customize the space for their specific needs. Each tenant, the bigger the tenant, the longer the lease, the more they spend. So we talk about refinancing risk. I think, Vishesh, perhaps you can chime in on this.
Yeah, if that's the question. I think I've seen data centers fail to finance. I have not seen them fail to refinance. But to be very honest, I don't think we have enough data points here in Asia today to say whether my conclusion is of any relevance. Because, I mean, we have refinanced, let's call it 2 or 3 deals, right? And none of the others have come for refinancing yet. But if I was to sort of look at what is there in the market and what's been done, with the exception of people not being able to build and complete in time and project having trouble, I don't see particular reasons why a data center may not be able to refinance. of course, the general economy, what happens to rates and all of that aside, right? I mean, we are all exposed to the global markets. But assuming things don't change drastically for the worse, I don't see why they would be able to not refinance. I've seen a lot of data centers not being able to finance. That's common.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Shireen.
Okay, so when we looked at the risk here, right? The moment the data center is completed and tenanted, okay, you have an income generating asset. Okay. Yes, I think commercial banks generally their sweet spot is 5 years, 7 years. Being a DFI, again, we do not like to be subjected to refinancing risk, and therefore we go long. But the moment the asset has sufficient income, I don't see any reason why you can't just go to another bank and raise funding again. So I think if the tenants are there to stay, income is good, then the refinancing risk is actually low.
Sure, and I suppose in structuring, having if the client owns the assets as opposed to leasing the assets, that provides some financial flexibility for the data center to have the exposure refinanced when the first loan becomes mature, right? So I think that's also one of the structuring approaches that or rather structuring considerations for lenders.
On that again, I mean, we have financed quite a few data centers where the underlying land and sometimes just the land, sometimes both the land and building were not owned by the data center operators. Because as I said, we ultimately look at the end source of cash flows, right? Which is the end customers. So in those, again, one of the challenges is if your underlying lease with your landlord, which could be the landowner or the land and core and shell owner, which is the propco, if that lease is say 15 years, that's a constraint, right? But again, say I'm not going to take names, but let's say in very developed countries here in Asia, you have local authority approvals for land. They are more a procedural thing rather than a real approval. So banks have been able to take that into account and put that into the refinancing methodology as well. So yes, one of the constraints where you don't own the property is your ultimate visibility on the total lease that you have, because you might not be able to be in that location. Barring that, I completely agree. Refinancing risk is very low. And again, in those situations, let's say you have a 15-year lease, your typical first loan is shorter than that. So people do refinance.
Thanks. Next question. Okay, let me just read it out. What do you see as a key challenge for data center projects to raise funding via bonds? I noticed, Shireen, in your slide, in the scheme that's under BPNB, bond guarantees, I believe I saw, is one of the products or one of the incentives. So can I just ask you for your thoughts on this? I think, and just to add, we've not seen bonds for data centers, not just in Malaysia, but I think generally in the Asian space, as opposed to CMBS, ABS structures in US. So please.
Yeah. Well, we have not seen any in the market. You're absolutely right. I think perhaps because most of the funding required is basically for construction of the data center, right? So when you have construction risk, rating will not be great. Okay, and therefore pricing can be a little bit high compared to completed projects. So that's why even for YTL, the news that we saw is basically bilateral loan syndicated deal done by banks. And on our side, we also prefer to give term financing. But once all these data centers are completed, it's fully tenanted. Again, the moment you have income generating asset, and provided that you can get good rating. I think this one goes back to RAM, on their methodology and the way they want to rate data centers and all, then perhaps, it's possible to tap into ABS or just the general bond or sukuk issuance. Yeah.
Yes, so I'd like to chime in on this, and just sharing experience from other markets as well. I believe the asset class is relatively new, and when investors consider a bond, they will need to seek credit approval, and they will need to assess the sector risk on top of the issuer-specific kind of risk. It takes time for that, and this is my sales pitch. That's where credit enhancement comes into play. We can bridge that understanding or that gap in understanding of the sector, have the investors be comfortable with the risk of the guarantor. Of course, we will also wrap the guarantee based on our own developmental objectives, some of which are to encourage more digital infrastructure bonds, to encourage these bonds to be thematic as well. So I think that those challenges, whatever they may be, can be bridged by guarantors, not just CGI, but there are other players as well in the bond guarantee market. There's another question on REX. So Rizal, this is for you. Differences between carbon credits and REX, which one is the best for DC players?
All right. So I'm going to assume that this is on the user side. That means as a data center using carbon credits and REX or offsetting their emissions. So the key difference between carbon credits and REX is that carbon credits are generated in and measured in 1 ton CO2 equivalent, either, as I mentioned before, from a project that avoids, reduce, or removes emissions from the atmosphere. So carbon credits can be used to offset your scope 1, scope 2, and also scope 3 emissions. So it's applicable across the board and can be offset using any type of carbon projects. Whereas for RECs, they are only applicable for you to reduce your scope 2 emissions. So that being said, the majority, if I recall correctly, the majority of data centers would have really high scope 2 emissions as compared to scope 1 and scope 3. But nonetheless, it can be used in tandem and complementing each other, that you can use your carbon credits, and this is what most corporates do actually, use your carbon credits to offset your scope 1 and scope 3, and you can use your REX to reduce your scope 2 emissions. So you can actually combine them together and reduce further your emissions portfolio. Thanks.
Thanks, Rizal. I think we are out of time. So apologize for the questions that we cannot answer. We'll find some way to answer them after this. So I'd like to thank my fellow panelists. This was very engaging for me. I hope it was the same for you. Please, round of applause for our panelists, and thank you for your time.
All right, once again, thank you to our esteemed panelists. And of course, once again, we'd like to invite our panelists for a photo opportunity. All right. So I think with the discussion that we had early on, probably we'll answer some of your questions pertaining to the Bursa Carbon Exchange and of course the financings of the data center. And of course, you have the opportunity to speak to our esteemed panelists later on a one-to-one basis. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, let's give a big round of applause to our moderator and panelists, namely Mohammed Rizal, Vishesh Gupta, Joey, and of course, Shireen.